A churchgoer wrote a letter to the editor of a newspaper and complained that it made no sense to go to church every Sunday. "I've gone for 30 years now," he wrote, "and in that time I've heard something like 1,500 sermons. But for the life of me, I can't remember a single one of them. So I think I'm wasting my time, and the priests are wasting theirs by giving sermons at all." So of course this started quite a controversy in the letters to the editor column, much to the delight of the editor. And it went on for a few weeks until someone wrote this letter. "I've been married for 30 years now. In that time, my wife has cooked some 32,000 meals. But for the life of me, I cannot recall the entire menu for a single one of those meals. But I do know this: they all nourished me and gave me strength I needed to do my work. If my wife had not given me these meals, I would be physically dead today. Likewise, if I had not gone to church for nourishment, I would be spiritually dead today." It is the Lord our God who brought us and our ancestors up from the land of Egypt. Joshua is reminding the tribes of Israel that God is a promise keeper. This is from the first reading today, because Joshua had gathered the people at Shechem for a crucial meeting, and when the tribes came together, he formed them into the nation of Israel. Joshua had led them into battle against the Canaanites, and the people were motivated in their struggle by the belief that God had promised them a land of their own. And with their success, Joshua called the Israelites to renew the covenant, to recommit themselves to God. There were other religions to draw the people away from God, but Joshua makes it very clear: the people must commit to their God who led them out of slavery across the desert to the promised land. And Joshua sets the example by professing his own faith. "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." And that's what we want to imitate. First, for ourselves, to express and live by a clear statement of faith. "As for me, I will serve the Lord." But this is not just for ourselves. If we have a family, especially younger members, we want to set an example and have them join us in our commitment to God. Joshua's statement is also a prayer that we could make. "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." And we know that's what our younger generation needs from us. Not lectures and rules, but an example, a role model, who shows by words and actions, "As for me, I will serve the Lord." And if we can set the example for our children, then we can say, "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." The commitment that Joshua calls was not just for individual faithfulness to God. It's for the whole people and the nation to renew the covenant and commit themselves to their faithful God. And that's what we wish for South Africa, that we be a people faithful to God and to God's ways. The memory and the consequences of the political motivated violence and looting in July is really fresh in our minds. And we have the immense challenge of striving to imitate God's love for each member of our community and to respect the unique gifts of each member. People are different, yet Joshua calls each one to pledge allegiance to God. What Joshua is doing, he's stirring up the community's memory of God's saving actions for them, to spur them, to motivate them for the enthusiastic response and commitment. And we want to look back on our lives. We want to be tried, to be conscious of how God has stayed with us, especially through these very, very difficult times that we have faced and are facing right now. Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. Those words come from the second reading, and to our modern ears, this is just so wrong. The second reading from Ephesians borders on the offensive. Maybe it even crosses over the line, at least in our initial hearing. So the letter to the Ephesians was probably written by an unknown author in the Pauline tradition, and it's an example of how the early Christians adapted the household codes of their day, which came from the surrounding Greek world. These codes were based on subjection, setting forth the duties of the members of the household, the husband as the head, and then the wives, then the children, then the slaves. In the New Testament, these codes were Christianized, usually by adding terms like "in the Lord," or as we heard from Ephesians today, "out of reverence for Christ." So Ephesians presents marriage as a parable for the relations between Christ and his church. And this section that we heard today begins with the usual household codes teachings. Wives, be subject to your husbands. Then, elaborating in a more Christian sense, the writer calls for the husband to love his wife without reservation. And now the emphasis shifts to the responsibility of the husband to his wife. So Ephesians doesn't want to change the marriage code in the Greco-Roman world of the time. Instead, the author is trying to ask Christians to live in a fundamentally different way. And it's all there in that opening statement. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's key to understanding the passage. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. It's not just one being subject to the other, it's each being subject to each other out of reverence for Christ. In other words, live in a different way than those in the world around you. The husband, the master of the household who owns all the property and has all the power, is to subordinate himself to the one who's regarded as powerless. Indeed, he is to see his wife as higher than himself. So how can Ephesians ask for such a world-shattering way of behaving? Because Jesus is the model of such behavior. Though Jesus was Lord, he humbled himself and submitted himself out of love for us. Some Christian traditions, based on the one verse, one line, wives, be subject to your husbands, take that out of context in order to oppress women. It's painful to realize how much Scripture can be misinterpreted and abused. As we look at the context of this passage, we can see that the complete text requires mutual, self-sacrificing love, service, and sharing. In the Gospel, the disciples have to make a choice when Jesus asks them, "Do you want to leave me as well?" This is a turning point for the disciples. Do they want to continue with Jesus and believe in him, despite the hard teaching about the Eucharist that is placed before them? If they do, they must eat his body and drink his blood. In other words, be a full part of the Eucharistic memorial which recalls his death and resurrection. We are facing a very similar challenge today. During Alert Level 3, only 50 people are allowed to come to be part of the Eucharistic memorial in the celebration of Mass. And so the temptation is to stay at home and forget about my commitment. Sharing Jesus, the bread of life, binds us in a religious community, a community of faith, living by the example Jesus set in his sacrifice for us. And all the disciples have witnessed Jesus' works and heard his teachings. But just as coming to church, it's more than just a matter of showing up. Like the disciples, we too are asked to a full commitment to Christ. We heard how Joshua and his household gave themselves totally to God. Jesus makes it clear to his disciples that God has given them the gift to believe in him, and that gift we also have received. So it's not only this faith that brings us here to worship and give thanks. All of us are asked to respond to the one we receive, to follow Jesus, to share Jesus' life with one another, to be the witnesses of his life to the world.